I don't remember the exact moment I became a shadow of myself, but I felt it deeply 3 days ago, when my daughter slammed the car door and didn't look back. The tail lights disappeared down Route 66, leaving me standing there in the dust, with only my breath and a silence that had grown louder over the years. For decades I was a seamstress, of clothes, yes, but mostly of silence. And now at 72, I feel every stitch I ever made was just an effort to hold a secret together. Until now. Because today, for the first time, I'm ready to unravel that thread. My name is Helen Vargas. I live in a small rental house on the edge of a town near Flagstaff, Arizona. I mend clothes for neighbors and sell pies at the Sunday farmers market. My gray hair is always pulled back in a bun, and my hands still smell of thread and flour. I've never been much of a talker, but those who see me sitting alone on the church steps each evening, with my worn coat and faraway eyes, don't know I've kept a secret, stitched inside its lining for over half a century. I decided to speak now because my daughter, Sophia, chose to forget me. She called me bitter, dishonest, and left me at a gas station with nothing but the clothes on my back. But if she had opened my coat, she would have found the truth. I'm not writing this out of revenge or for sympathy. I do it because keeping it inside has been killing me slowly. What my father did to me didn't die with him. It lives on in the distrust in my daughter's eyes, in the quiet ways I tried to protect her from the same lies that were forced on me. Someone has to know who I was, who I am, and why I couldn't be anyone else. Telling this story feels like pulling out old stitches from fragile skin. It hurts, it bleeds, but it heals cleaner. For years, I believed silence was the only way to survive. I learned not to cry, to smile at the right moments, to pretend everything was fine. I was a girl who adored her mother, feared her father, and guarded her brother like he was treasure. I became a teenager who ran to save a child. I turned into a woman afraid to even meet her own reflection. And now, when the world seems ready to forget me, it's when I most need to be heard. If you've made it this far, please stay. Listen with your heart. Like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep telling stories like this. And tell me, where are you watching from? Because today, I don't need anyone to save me. I just need someone to see me. Hearing my story sets me free. And maybe, just maybe, it will free someone else too. I remember the color of our little farmhouse in northern New Mexico. Off-white siding, blue shutters, and a creaky porch that moaned under our bare feet. Back then, life moved at the pace of sunrise and supper bells. Our land stretched far, dry and golden, dotted with sagebrush and cottonwoods. My mother's cornbread smell filled the kitchen every morning, and the sound of her voice humming hymns was the melody of our lives. My younger brother, Marcus, and I didn't have much, but we had everything that mattered. Our father was a quiet man, hardened by years of labor, but Mama's love was the kind that made a place feel like heaven. Dad worked long hours at a lumber mill just outside Taos. He'd come home with his boots heavy with dust and his skin tanned deep by the sun. He rarely spoke, but on Sundays, he'd comb his hair, wear his best shirt, and drive us to the Baptist church in town. Mama would smooth our clothes, kiss our foreheads, and smile like that hour together was a blessing. I used to sit beside her holding Marcos's little hand, thinking that if we had her, we had it all. Her touch could quiet any storm. Our days began early. Mama would light the wood stove before dawn, and I helped her knead biscuit dough while Marcus fed the hens. After breakfast, we'd walk the dirt road to the little schoolhouse 3 miles away. It was one room for all grades, and Miss Trudy, our teacher, had a soft voice and a sharp eye. She taught us to read with the same care Mama used to braid my hair. During recess, we played tag around the water tower or sat under the old oak tree, drawing shapes in the dirt. When we got home, Mama would be waiting with sweet tea and a warm plate of beans and rice. Summers were full of heat and laughter. We'd run down to the creek near our land, splashing in the muddy water, chasing frogs, and pretending we were pirates. Mama packed jars of lemonade and leftover biscuits, wrapped in dish towels. We ate under the cottonwoods, sticky with heat and joy. The world felt safe, endless. The only time I ever felt fear was when a snake slithered too close or the wind howled loud through the canyon. There weren't toys from stores, but there were treasures everywhere. Mama sewed dolls from scraps, and Dad carved little animals out of wood. Marcus and I made up games with rocks and sticks. He was the best part of my world, curious, bright, full of questions. His laughter was the purest sound I've ever heard. He followed me everywhere, trusting me with the kind of devotion that made me feel braver than I was. When it rained, which wasn't often, we stayed indoors and listened to the patter on the roof like it was a concert just for us. Mama would pull out her quilting box, and I'd sit beside her, pretending to sew while she told us stories from her childhood in the Appalachians. Those were my favorite moments, when we all sat close, the fire crackling, the world outside forgotten. Market days were special. Once a month, we'd pile into the truck and head into town. Mama sold jars of preserves, homemade candles, and quilts she stitched late into the night. She let us pick a treat if we behaved. I always chose maple sugar candy, and Marcus went for peanut brittle. Watching Mama trade stories and recipes with other women, laughing and joking, made me see how strong and capable she was. She was everything I ever wanted to be. At night, we'd lie on blankets, outside, and stare at the stars. Dad smoked in silence, and Mama would talk softly about her dreams, about the places she never got to see. Marcus would point out constellations he made up. I held on to those nights like secrets. The scent of the junipers, the warmth of Mama's arm around me, they are etched into the deepest part of me. Sometimes I'd catch Mama sitting alone in the kitchen, her hands still, her eyes far away. I didn't understand why she looked so sad, but the next morning, she'd smile and sing while she swept the floor, like nothing had happened. I believed her joy was unshakable. I wanted to believe it, we all did. One time Marcus got really sick, a fever that wouldn't go down. Mama stayed by his side for days, barely sleeping. Dad even prayed, which I had never seen him do. When Marcus finally got better, Mama made a peach cobbler, even though we were low on sugar. We celebrated like it was a holiday. That cobbler tasted like hope. Winters were cold and quiet. We'd gather around the fireplace in the evenings, drinking hot cocoa and listening to Mama hum old church songs. She told us stories about snowstorms from her girlhood and how her mother used to warm their boots by the fire. I'd close my eyes and imagine those times, feeling connected to something bigger than our little farm. That was my childhood, plain, simple, full of moments that shimmered with warmth. I didn't know back then that happiness could be so fragile, that love, no matter how strong, couldn't always protect you from the dark. But in those early years, I believed it could, and for a while, that was enough. It started with a fever, nothing dramatic, just a low one that made Mama stay in bed for a day or two. She said it was probably the flu, but by the third day, her skin turned pale and damp, and her eyes lost that gentle spark. We didn't have a hospital nearby, just Doc Miller, an old man who came around with a black bag and trembling hands. He gave her some pills and told, "Daddy, it should pass." But it didn't. She stopped talking. Her breathing changed, and by the end of the week, she was gone. The day we buried her, the sun didn't shine. It was still hot, still dry, but the world felt empty. We laid her to rest on the ridge above the farm, next to a lone mesquite tree she used to sit under with her Bible. Daddy didn't cry. He stood stiff, his jaw tight, his hat pulled low. When the preacher finished his short prayer, Daddy just turned and walked back to the truck. He didn't say a word. That was the last time I saw him look like the man who used to kiss Mama's temple when he thought no one was watching. The house turned silent. Not a quiet of mourning, but something heavier, cold. My father started rising earlier, coming home later. But when he was inside, the air changed. He moved slower, spoke less. His silence wasn't grieving. It was sharp. calculated. He looked at me differently, like I owed him something, like I reminded him of what he'd lost, and he didn't forgive me for it. Marcus didn't understand, but he followed my lead. We talked less, ate quietly. I started avoiding eye contact with Daddy altogether. Then the rules changed. Daddy told me I had to quit school. "You're the woman of the house now," he said, handing me Mama's apron without looking me in the eye. I was 14. He kept Marcus enrolled, but only so long as I kept the house in perfect order. If I burned dinner, if I forgot to sweep, if I left a towel out of place, there were consequences. Not with words, but with force. He'd slam doors, knock over chairs, break dishes. Once he grabbed my wrist so hard I had bruises for days. I learned not to make mistakes, or at least not to let him see them. The farm no longer felt like home. It became a place to survive, not to live. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, doing laundry, baking cornbread, feeding the chickens, all under his watch. He didn't yell often, he didn't need to. His presence was enough. Marcus started having nightmares. I'd wake up to him crying, crawling into my bed, whispering that he missed Mama. I held him, told him we'd be okay, but I wasn't sure I believed it. There were no visitors. Daddy stopped going to church. People assumed he was still grieving, but they didn't see what happened behind closed doors. In town, he was still respected. Still, Mr. Vargas, the quiet widower raising 2 kids alone. No one questioned anything. No one looked close enough to see how his smile had become a mask, how his hands, once calloused from work, now trembled with something else entirely. That was when I realized no one was coming to save us. We were on our own, and I was the only thing standing between my little brother and the man our father had become. After Mama died, Daddy didn't just fill her place in the house. He overtook it, but not with love or protection. He did it with rules, glances, and control that grew sharper by the day. At first it was little things. He'd stand too close when I was cooking. His hand would linger too long when he passed me a dish. He started calling me his girl in a tone that didn't sound right. I was 14, and I started to dread being alone in a room with him. My stomach would tighten every time the screen door creaked shut behind him. He stopped calling me Helen. He started saying things like, "You look just like your mother in that dress." I stopped wearing anything but oversized shirts and jeans, clothes that buried me. He'd still find something to comment on. "You shouldn't hide what God gave you," he once whispered, brushing my shoulder. His voice was low, sickly, sweet. I wanted to scream, but I just nodded, eyes down, like I was trained to do. He began coming into my room at night, at first just to check on me. He'd sit on the edge of the bed, talk about how hard his days were, how lonely the house felt. Sometimes he'd cry. That was the worst. His tears, because they made me question if I was the one being cruel for pulling away. One night he laid his hand on my leg and said, "You don't have to be scared. I'd never hurt you." But I knew better. That hand felt like a warning. During the day, he acted like nothing happened. He laughed with Marcus, fixed the fence, mowed the fields. At church, when we went, he'd shake hands with the pastor and hug the neighbors. People always told me how strong he was, how lucky we were to have a man like him. I'd smile and nod, but inside, I wanted to disappear. The house became a trap. Every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind through the windows felt like a threat. I started hiding things. Notes under my mattress, tiny pieces of paper where I wrote what he did, what he said. I didn't know who they were for, maybe just for me, so I wouldn't forget that it was real. I'd tuck them into a hole in the wall behind Mama's sewing machine. Writing became my only way of screaming, because if I told someone, if I made it real in the outside world, he might take it out on Marcus, and I couldn't let that happen. Marcus was only 10, and Daddy used him like a bargaining chip. "Be good," he'd tell me, "and Marcus stays happy." If I ever hesitated, if I pulled away, he'd punish Marcus instead. He once made him sleep in the barn for tracking dirt inside. Another time, he ripped up one of his drawings. I learned fast. If I smiled at the right moment, if I said, "Yes, sir," my brother would be safe. So I did. I played along, and every night I cried in silence. He watched everything I did, counted the eggs, the logs in the firewood pile, the sugar in the jar. I wasn't allowed to leave the property unless it was with him. He burned one of my shirts when he found a note from a girl at church in the pocket. "No secrets in this house," he said. He didn't yell. He never yelled. Just burned things or broke them or stared until I felt like I was shrinking inside my own skin. One day he told me to wear one of Mama's old dresses to Sunday service. She was a good woman, he said. It's time you honored her. The fabric felt like ice on my skin. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the girl staring back. She looked hollow, smaller than ever. That night he stood in the doorway and said, "You're the only woman left in this house, Helen. That means something." I didn't sleep at all. I started making plans in my head. If he did this, I'd run. If he went too far, I'd find a way to stop him. But when you live in fear, even thinking is dangerous. I hid sharp objects in places only I knew, behind the pantry, under the floorboard near my bed. Not because I wanted to use them, just to know I had something, anything, that he didn't control. He once found one of my hiding places, a tiny notebook with my scribbled thoughts. He read it without saying a word, then tore it up in front of me and burned it in the fireplace. I stood there, frozen. "Words don't change anything," he said. "You live in my house. You follow my rules." That night, he locked my bedroom door from the outside. I stared at the ceiling until morning, feeling like I'd already died. From then on, I didn't write anymore. I stitched pieces of cloth instead, little symbols into my clothes, a star, a circle, a line. Marks only I understood. It was the only way I had left to speak. Each stitch was a promise. I remember, I see, I survive. People in town still asked how we were doing. "We're managing," I'd say. "Daddy's trying hard." No one looked deeper. No one asked what it cost to keep pretending, and maybe I didn't want them to. Because if someone knew, really knew, I wasn't sure I could survive what would come next. From the outside, everything looked normal. I kept the house spotless. The windows gleamed, the sheets were pressed, and the pantry stayed stocked. Breakfast was always on the table by 6, lunch packed for Marcus, dinner ready before the sun went down. Daddy liked it that way. Predictable, controlled. I learned to move silently, to anticipate his moods from the way he opened the screen door or how heavy his boots sounded on the porch. I became an expert in walking the line between obedience and invisibility. My hands, once soft from threading needles with Mama, grew rough with scrubbing and sewing. I worked from sunrise to nightfall. My fingers cracked, bleeding sometimes. I stopped brushing my hair. I stopped looking in mirrors. I wore the same 3 oversized flannel shirts and jeans until they faded. Daddy didn't comment anymore. He knew I was broken enough not to fight. But still, I tucked pins inside my sleeves, needles in the hem of my jeans, not as weapons, but as reminders. I still had secrets he didn't know. I stopped sleeping. Most nights, I'd lie awake and count the cracks in the ceiling or listen for the creak of the floorboards. When I did sleep, I dreamed of Mama. Sometimes she'd hum while she quilted. Other times she'd sit on the porch and whisper, "You have to protect him." I'd wake up with tears on my face and the sheets soaked in sweat. I'd creep to Marcus's room and watch him breathe, watch the way his little chest rose and fell, and swear to myself I'd keep him safe no matter what. Marcus was my anchor. I fed him, helped him with homework, kept his favorite blanket clean, made up stories to help him sleep. I told him Mama was watching us. I never let him see my bruises or hear me cry. I made his world small and soft, so he wouldn't know the darkness just outside his door when Daddy punished him. Too harsh, too often. I'd find ways to make it better. A hot bath, a story, an extra slice of pie I'd hidden in the shed, small mercies to patch the cracks I couldn't stop from forming. Daddy didn't need to hit me often anymore. The threat was enough. His eyes did more damage than his hands ever could. I stopped speaking unless I had to. I nodded, obeyed, moved like a ghost. I had become what he wanted, silent, controlled, broken. But deep down, there was a small ember that refused to die. Stubborn piece of me that remembered the girl who once ran barefoot through sunflowers and believed her mama's love could keep her safe. I kept her hidden, but I fed her, quietly, secretly, with hope. I learned to hide bruises under layers of clothes, to fake headaches so I wouldn't have to go into town. I knew which neighbors asked too many questions and which ones looked the other way. I avoided both. At church I sat in the back, head down. I clutched the hymnal like it was a shield. When people asked how we were, I said we were managing. I smiled with my mouth, but not my eyes. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose not to. I began marking time differently, not by dates, but by routines. Mondays were laundry and baking. Tuesdays were for checking the root cellar. Wednesdays I'd try to slip away for 10 minutes and sit behind the barn just to breathe. I started counting how many days Daddy didn't touch me. Those were victories. I carved a notch in the wood under my bed for each one. Some weeks there were no notches. Every now and then, he'd talk to me like a husband would to a wife. I don't need anyone else, he'd say. You take care of this house just like your mama did. I'd nod, heart racing, hands cold. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending, but I also didn't know how to stop. My silence had become armor and a cage. When I dared to hope, I thought about running. I imagined grabbing Marcus and walking through the fields until we hit the highway, sticking out our thumbs, and vanishing into another life. But I had no money, no plan, no one to trust. And Daddy had made it clear, if you ever leave, you won't like what happens next. I believed him. I still do. I kept hidden stashes, small, desperate attempts at freedom. A pair of sturdy shoes under the floorboards, a tin of coins wrapped in cloth, a map I tore from the back of an old atlas. I read it at night, tracing routes with my finger. Anywhere was better than here. Even if I didn't know where there was, I memorized every creak of the house. I knew which steps groaned and which ones were silent. I knew how to sneak down the hallway without making a sound. I knew the sound of Daddy's breath when he was drunk, when he was angry, when he was plotting. I lived by those sounds. They were my weather, my survival. When my period stopped for 3 months, I thought I might be pregnant. I cried for hours alone in the shed, my hands over my mouth to muffle the sobs. But it came. Late, but it came. Afterward, I felt both relief and shame so deep it felt like it lived in my bones. I started avoiding Daddy even more. But he noticed. He always noticed. Marcus brought me a flower once, a little wildflower he'd picked by the creek. He said, "It's for you because you always take care of me." I cried so hard, that night I thought I'd never stop. But I made sure he didn't see. I smiled and tucked it behind my ear. That flower dried up and crumbled days later, but I kept the stem hidden in a jar inside Mama's Bible. That became my ritual. Small things, tiny pieces of beauty I could hide away. A feather, a smooth stone, a thread of blue yarn. Each one meant, you're still here. You still feel. You still hope. And as long as I had those, I knew I hadn't given up. Not completely. The first crack in the silence came with a paper flower. Marcus made it during art class and brought it home in his lunchbox. He handed it to me, shyly, and said, "It's a daisy, because you're the bravest person I know." I nearly dropped it. My throat closed up. I hadn't felt seen in so long I forgot what it meant. That flower stayed on my nightstand for weeks, a defiant burst of color in a house washed in gray. It reminded me there was still something worth fighting for, someone worth surviving for. I started changing little things, not enough to raise suspicion, just enough to feel like I still had choices. I moved Daddy's tools in the barn, swapped the sugar jar with the flour, left the back gate unlatched. I began memorizing times, how long it took him to drive to town, how often he stopped at the diner, how late he stayed out on Thursdays. I studied his patterns like a hunter, not because I was brave, but because I needed to know when it was safe to breathe. I also watched people more closely. Miss Clara, the librarian at the church, always smiled kindly and asked if I needed anything. One day I dropped a stitched handkerchief in her collection basket with a tiny letter H sewn into the corner. She looked at it for a long time before slipping it into her pocket. The next Sunday, she left a book on the church bench next to me, one about women who overcame the impossible. No words were exchanged, but I knew she saw me. I wasn't invisible after all. When Daddy wasn't home, I read that book like it was sacred. Every story, every sentence, felt like a rope thrown into a well I'd been trapped in. These women, real women, had clawed their way out. Maybe I could, too. I started writing again, not in full sentences, just words stitched into the seams of my clothes. Freedom, run someday, truth. They weren't just words. They were promises. I wore them like armor. With Marcus, I changed my voice. Softer but sharper. I taught him how to listen between people's words, how to notice when someone was lying, how to trust his instincts. I told him Mama used to say, God gave us 2 ears so we could hear what wasn't being said. He nodded, eyes wide. He started asking more questions, watching Daddy with a different kind of awareness. I couldn't tell him everything, but I was preparing him, just in case. I made a habit of sneaking out just after dawn to walk the edge of the property. I'd say I was feeding the hens, but really I was timing how long it would take to reach the road, where the trail curved down into the valley, how visible I was from the house. I buried an old biscuit tin near the creek with some coins, a map, and a pair of socks. It wasn't much, but it was something. One evening, Daddy asked me why I wasn't wearing Mama's perfume anymore. I froze. My mind raced, but I just said, it ran out. He stared for a moment, then turned away. That night, I took the tiny bottle I had hidden and poured it into the dirt behind the barn. I didn't want to smell like her. I didn't want to be his replacement for anything. I wanted to be invisible to him. I became sharper, faster, quieter. I learned to track his moods with the precision of a weathered scout. I could tell by how he slammed the truck door whether he was drunk, angry, or both. I started placing small objects, buttons, pins, bits of thread, across doorways. If they were moved, I knew he'd been snooping. I stopped thinking of the house as a prison. I started thinking of it as a battlefield, and I intended to win, even if it took everything I had. It was a Friday afternoon when everything broke wide open. Daddy had been gone all morning, supposedly out checking fence lines. The sky was gray and heavy, and the air felt thick, like the world was holding its breath. I was in the kitchen, rolling out pie dough for a church event Miss Clara had invited me to help with. My first real invitation in years. I was humming softly to myself, something Mama used to sing. When I heard the front door creak open, I knew by the sound of his steps that something was wrong. They were slower, heavier. He walked into the kitchen, eyes red and glazed, reeking of whiskey. My hands froze. On the rolling pin. He stared at me for a long time before he said, "You remind me too much of her today." I didn't respond. I never did. He took a step closer, then another. "Maybe it's time you stop pretending you're anything else." His voice was low, dangerous. He reached for my arm. This time, I didn't flinch. I looked him straight in the eye and whispered, "Don't." The word surprised me. It came out steady, strong, like it had been waiting for years. He paused, stunned. That pause was all I needed. I grabbed the rolling pin and lifted it, not to hit him, but to hold space between us. "You touch me again, and I swear to God I'll scream loud enough for every neighbor in this valley to hear." My voice trembled but didn't break. Something in his face shifted. For the first time, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. He didn't say another word, just turned and walked out. The screen door banged behind him and I collapsed to the floor, shaking. I stayed there for minutes, or hours, I don't know. My back against the cabinets, the smell of flour in my nose, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. That night I didn't sleep. I packed 2 bags, one for me, one for Marcus. I left them hidden in the shed, next to the shovel Mama used to plant herbs. The next morning I walked Marcus to the bus stop like always, but before he stepped on, I knelt and looked him in the eye. Be ready. I might come for you tonight, and when I do, we leave. No questions. He didn't ask why. He just nodded and hugged me tight. I think part of him always knew this moment would come. That night, as soon as Daddy went to bed, passed out more like, I slipped outside, grabbed the bags, and headed to the school. I waited in the shadows until Marcus climbed out a back window, just like we'd planned. We didn't run. We walked, slowly, carefully along the fence line, through the woods, past the dried-up creek bed until we reached the highway. We didn't stop until we reached Miss Clara's house. She opened the door like she'd been waiting. No questions, just blankets, hot cocoa, and the softest, kindest silence I'd ever heard. In that moment, I knew we were never going back. Not to that house, not to that life, and for the first time in years, I slept without waiting for the door to creak open. We never set foot on that land again. We didn't go back for clothes, for keepsakes, not even for Mama's photo. I didn't need any of it. What I carried with me was more than enough. The memory of her voice, the strength she gave me, and the quiet fire that had kept me alive all those years. Miss Clara helped us get to Albuquerque, where a women's shelter gave us a bed, food, and, most importantly, names for what we had survived. Abuse, control, survival. Words I'd never let myself say out loud until then. Marcus grew up into a kind, thoughtful man. He teaches history at a high school now, the kind of teacher kids actually talk to. He tells stories, plays old country records in class, and never raises his voice. He says I taught him how to be gentle in a hard world. I still don't know how I did that. Maybe just by keeping him close, by loving him louder than the hate that tried to swallow us whole. As for me, I went back to sewing, opened a little alterations shop in a small town outside Santa Fe. It didn't make much money, but it gave me purpose, a place to stitch new beginnings. That's where I met Antonio. He wasn't handsome or charming, but he was safe, steady, the kind of man who asked before he reached for your hand. I married him, not out of passion, but out of peace. He gave me that. And with him, I had Sophia. I tried to give her everything I didn't have, but I also gave her silence. I never told her the truth about my past. I thought I was protecting her. But silence, I learned, has a way of rotting everything it touches. My father, her grandfather, found her when she was older, filled her head with lies about me, said I abandoned the family, ran off with a man, broke his heart. She believed him, and I never corrected her until now. Now I sit here, on this roadside bench, coat wrapped tight around me, not with money, or plans, or family, but with something more important, the truth. In the lining of this coat are the letters my mama wrote me before she died, letters my father hid, and the deed to the land she left in my name. He tried to erase me, but he couldn't, because the truth, like a seed buried deep, always finds a way to bloom. Thank you for listening. If this story spoke to you, please like, subscribe, and share it. It helps more than you know. And now I'd love to hear from you. What did you feel while listening to this story? Let's talk in the comments. Maybe together we can stitch a little more light into the dark.